UK's Prime Minister Theresa May has had a tough job since she came into office. Her biggest challenge, Brexit, which explains the title, the Brexit Prime Minister. And to this day, this has plagued her administration. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss where Brexit stands when it comes to the negotiations with the EU. This is while May will come under pressure from business leaders to speed up negotiations with the European Union. Press TV's Amina Taylor joins us from London. She's been following Brexit developments to tell us about two major developments happening. Well, you got the deadline that's looming. You got this letter. If you can tell us what and how those two stand.
Well, what an absolutely disastrous week for the Prime Minister, and it's just kicking off. I mean, we're right on the tail of the resignation, quote, sacking of Priti Patel, and of course, Mrs. May losing her defense secretary, only to wake up this morning to news that Boris Johnson, her arch rival, and a man we thought was his arch rival, one Mr. Michael Gove, had actually sent a private letter to Mrs. May's private secretary and the Prime Minister to say, listen, things with Brexit aren't going as quickly as we would like, and pretty much can you move stuff along? Now, this was not supposed to be seen by the public. It's in fact been leaked. So we now know that not only is Mrs. May under considerable pressure from those who are looking tomorrow during this new vote on the EU withdrawal bill to actually gain some concessions for the Remainers, but she's under strict policy deadline issues and deadlock issues within her own cabinet. I mean, if the Prime Minister doesn't get a handle on this, she's going to look incredibly weak to people like Michel Barnier, who's, of course, leading those EU negotiations. And then very briefly, we, of course, have David Davis, the European Brexit Secretary, today, just within an hour or so, saying that there will be a final vote for parliamentarians on Brexit. So will this mean Brexit will be blocked? Does this mean that Brexit will be dragged out? Because part of this letter, Carvey, that Gove and Johnson put together, they talked about not having this transition deal go over 2021. So I think the Remainers and the hardline Brexiteers are locked in battle right now. And perhaps tomorrow, when that EU deal is renegotiated in Parliament and we have a vote, we'll see which side is winning.
Very well. Thank you for that. We appreciate it. Amina Taylor, of course, one of there talking to us from London. Let's get some analysis on this. Investigative journalist Tony Gosling joins us from Wiltshire in the UK, and writer and lecturer Jonathan Fryer joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. Jonathan Fryer, I'd like to start with you. Theresa May in negotiations with the European Union for quite some time at this point. Well, maybe not so much time. I mean, we're talking since June. Is she getting a fair shake on this? I mean, is she doing well or not? Of course, we can't just say her in particular. You also have Davis who's leading the negotiations.
Indeed, it is David Davis who's at the head of negotiations, and although he's been trying to give a very optimistic pitch about the way things are going, there is increasing frustration and indeed confusion in Brussels, not only by Michel Barnier, the chief EU negotiator, but by the other 27 member states who believe that Britain still has not made clear exactly what it wants. And of course, there are still three major outstanding issues: the financial divorce bill, it's being called, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and other things which mean that basically no future deal can be agreed until all that is settled.
Well, let's see. Tony Gosling, our guest there, says the UK has not made clear what it wants. Is that really accurate? I mean, they must have said a few things of what they may want, but altogether to say that it's not clear what it wants, do you see it that way?
This letter that we've had leaked, I think, is fascinating, as it shows that actually many of the politicians here in Britain are much more interested in their own political fights within the Conservative Party than they are about actually making a good deal for Britain. Looking at this strategic leak, I would say that's what it is. It's not just some sort of accidental bit of information that's got out. I would even suggest that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove are behind that leak because they actually want Theresa May out of the way. And I would suggest that's actually quite a good thing at this important time for Britain. I mean, because we are really leading many people across Europe away from Brussels. There's a very powerful move for people to just get disentangled from the European Union. We need to have a strong government. We haven't got a strong government. We've got an extremely weak government. Theresa May's got no political authority whatsoever. She's got her ministers running rings around her, and she's also not in a position of ever having been elected into the post. So I think, actually, it might be a good idea for her to just get out of the way and to allow the 120,000 or so members of the Conservative Party to select the leader that they want, not the leader that was put in charge of the party after Cameron left by what many insiders I've spoken to say effectively are the securocrats. That is to say, the secret services in Britain and the political operators behind the scenes wanted Theresa May in that job, and that's why she's there. She's clearly not up to the task, and if we're going to have a Brexit which is good for the UK, she needs to go.
Okay, well, do you agree, Jonathan Fryer, with that? I mean, we have had Theresa May's government plagued by two high-profile resignations, and of course, with reports indicating 40 MPs have agreed to sign a letter of no confidence.
Indeed, yes. And I mean, although Tony and I are coming at this from very different perspectives about where we see things are going and where we maybe hope things are going, I think we're both agreed that indeed Theresa May has been horrendously weakened by the splits within her own parliamentary party, indeed within her own cabinet. There's behind the scenes warfare between various ministers, with on one side, for example, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, who was a strong Remainer in the EU referendum last year and who is arguing for the so-called soft Brexit, which would mean that we would not have a cliff edge departure or a no-deal departure, whereas others, including Messrs Johnson and Gove, earlier mentioned, are basically saying, well, we should really play it hardball, and if we don't get a deal that we want, and they haven't yet quite defined what they want, then we should walk away. So, as I say, Tony and I have very different views on this, but we agree Theresa May is a dead duck, but there's nobody obvious to replace her.
Well, Tony Gosling, first of all, let's talk about what seems to be in black and white, or maybe it's not, but it seems to be something that the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has said from the get-go, and it's this divorce bill. And he had said up to 80 billion euros. I think the figure 60 billion euros is maybe up for discussion here. How important is this divorce bill on the rest of the process? I mean, is it all or nothing when it comes to it?
Well, actually, the divorce bill, in a way, is a way of kind of spiking the negotiations, I think, from the EU, insisting on this money. I would suggest, actually, there needn't be any divorce bill at all. It needs to be a severance of an agreement, but that doesn't mean to say that one side or the other has to pay anything. What's happening is also, I noticed this week, that Angela Merkel in Germany has said that, that the Germans will make up the shortfall when Britain leaves of the money that the British used to pay in. So I would have thought that, that the Germans could pay that divorce bill if the British decide not to. I think we've got to be realistic about what is Brussels and what is going to happen with this negotiation. I don't think that Barnier, for a start, is in any way accountable to the democratic structures of Brussels. That is to say, he's not accountable to the European Parliament. He's accountable to the Commission, which are just appointees. So effectively, he's got complete freedom to say what he wants. He's not. No one is saying to him, no, you can't say that, you can't say that, you must do this, you must do that. It's not actually no lines of accountability with Barnier. So what he's doing is he's playing extreme hardball. I think actually there's also behind all this, there are extremely powerful movements in other parts of Europe that want to secede from Brussels. And so you've got Barnier trying to make sure that Britain gets punished as much as possible for choosing to leave the European Union, and it sets an example for others around Europe to dissuade them from doing the same. And so he's going to make things as difficult as he possibly can. That's why he's who he is, and he's not democratically accountable. And it says a lot about the way that the European Union is run, I think, about the accountability of it. You know, you've got effectively, well, I suppose the British on the one hand. I mean, our Conservative government is similar in some ways, but it makes a distinction between whether the political leaders in Brussels are actually serving the public of Europe. Let's remember 800 million people that they are in some way governing in Brussels. Are they our servants doing what we want, or are they a bunch of control freaks? And I'm afraid they are effectively running cartels across the continent, and they are, I think, the latter rather than the former. And this attitude to negotiation proves what I say. They actually are punishing Britain. They don't actually want...
So now we're getting somewhere. Okay, Jonathan Fryer, so punishing the UK at the expense of costing Prime Minister Theresa May maybe her job, would that be good for the EU or bad, if that's the case?
Well, I have to say I don't accept the premise of any of Tony's recent arguments. For the first point, which is a point of fact, Michel Barnier has the very difficult task of trying to get agreement amongst the 27 other governments of the 27 member states as to what exactly they want to get out of the EU deal with Britain after Brexit, if Brexit actually happens. But there is no question that Brussels is trying to punish Britain. That is nonsense. It is for the EU, obviously, extremely inconvenient that Brexit is going ahead, because it means that so many of the programs which the British are already signed up to are now under threat because of Britain leaving, but more importantly because the whole of EU politics, like British politics, is dominated by this Brexit issue, which is infecting virtually every sector of political and economic debate. And all the other EU states, in various different degrees, are very disturbed by the possibilities of what Brexit may mean, particularly if it is a no-deal Brexit and we follow Boris Johnson's famous line of not giving a farthing, in other words, a tiny bit of money to the EU. And let's also say on that divorce bill, you know, it's a rather bad phrase for it, because actually this is money that Britain already committed to pay for EU programs which are going to roll out over the next couple of years. So in other words, it's living up to commitments, which is why Theresa May, and one good thing to her credit is she accepts that, and she said, yes, Britain is an honourable nation and we will live up to our commitments.
Well, Tony Gosling, when you talk about the fact that the EU is punishing the UK, I think at the end there you said that because ultimately, if I'm correct in understanding you, that maybe the EU does not want the UK to actually leave. Is that what the EU is pushing for?
I think they are thinking, see the European leaders, mostly as whether or not they are protecting the behalf of the people in Britain. Now, they may not like what the Britons did. They may not like in Catalonia decided recently to leave Spain. But what they should be doing is upholding people's democratic rights. And I mean, if they'd have done a better job in running the economy in Europe, and you know, this isn't just the Europe.
Okay, unfortunately, I got to jump in. We're just not having a good audio connection. Jonathan Fryer, we have to talk about businesses. They are asking for reassurances, and what they're looking at in terms of the reassurances, that's what is somewhat in question here. What is it that exactly they want?
Well, the main thing that they're asking for is that we should be able to stay within the European single market. In other words, continue the situation we have at present, which is that British businesses can sell without tariffs and other barriers to the other 27 member states, and vice versa, which is terribly important. Now, at the core of this, of course, is the so-called transitional period, which could be 2 years or maybe longer. Indeed, many businesses in Britain are saying 2 years isn't long enough. We can't adjust in 2 years from a change of circumstances to moving to being outside of the single market. And indeed, British businesses, of course, have been amongst the most vociferous campaigners who hope, and it is a hope, albeit not a very perhaps realistic one, that Brexit will prove to be so impossible that it won't happen and we will stay in the EU after all.
Tony Gosling, the reassurances that the businesses want is focused on, first and foremost, on this transitional progress or transitional phase, What is exactly this transitional phase that they want reassurances on?
Well, you know what, personally, I'm not interested in what businesses want. Businesses have had what they want from the European Union for decades now, and look where it's left us. In Britain, we've got over 1 million people now, families, that is, using food banks. We're being told that the migrants who are coming to Britain, working here, are doing us a favour. Actually, what it's meant is that lots of British people, millions of British people, have been decanted out of those jobs, and their labour has been undercut. Sometimes only people prepared to come to Britain and work for just half what the British people were working for. And so, you know, we have got a disaster in the economy, as I was saying, in the euro-dollar zone. We had the 2008 bailouts, which, in my mind, was the end of capitalism. Once we've got banks that are bankrupt, being propped up by the government, we've got socialism for the super rich. And the amounts of money that are being spent on this war on terror, we just heard this week, didn't we? I think it was in the Wall Street Journal that the cost for is $5.6 trillion for the war on terror. What's happening is all of this money that's being created is going towards war, and this is an absolute disaster. They have completely wrecked the European and American economies. And so I think what's going to happen, this is my little prediction, is that once Brexit happens, the economy is going to crash and everybody is going to blame Brexit, at which point I would suggest that most people's money will be sucked up by the governments, that if they've got any money in savings, most of it will go to the governments to pay off these ridiculous debts of these parasitic zombie banks. If I had some savings, which I don't have much in the way of savings, I would put them in Russia, actually, where there's around about 7% interest rates. So I think that's the backstory to all of this, is that we've got a crash looming, and the Brexit is going to be blamed for that crash. Actually, it's inevitable. With or without Brexit, this crash is coming sooner or later.
Okay, well, let's see here. Jonathan Fryer, British officials, they want certainty. You say that they don't know what they want, but they want certainty that the EU will reciprocate and at the same time agree to the outlines of a transition deal. That doesn't sound like what you said about the UK. You said that they don't know exactly what they want. What is it then that they're saying here, based on what I'm looking at, that they want certainty that the EU is going to reciprocate? What do they want the EU to reciprocate? Jonathan Fryer? Tony Gosling, question to you.
What do the European Union want to reciprocate? I think a lot of the time what we're seeing here with the negotiations is a kind of shadow play, really, where the one side, actually I would say the EU is worse than Britain, because David Davis almost seems sometimes like a bit of a rabbit in the headlights. He doesn't realise that what he's dealing with here are people that do just simply want to punish Britain. So when it comes to reciprocation, I'd like to see some from the EU as well. That is to say, we need to have equitable on both sides. So in other words, if Britain was to go to the EU and say, right, well, we want 20 billion euros from you when we leave the EU, I don't think the European Union would take that as a sensible negotiating position. And yet Britain is supposed to take that as a sensible negotiating position. So they're abusing their power, as they have been for the last 30 or 40 years, actually, since I suppose the Maastricht Treaty, which turned the EU, which we joined originally as a common market, into this United States of Europe. It's one country, it's a political system that we're now part of, that most people across Europe are now deciding they've had enough of, because it's simply not working. And that's because it's not democratic. And we've seen that as a perfect example with Brexit. We've had a democratic vote for the British people to leave, and the way that we've been treated by the Brussels people, I suppose, is what you'd expect from a bunch of control freaks and dictators. Effectively, they're running a cartel, a massive cartel of cartels from Brussels. And they are used to just deciding for themselves what happens. They don't like the idea that anybody, particularly here in Britain, might say, well, we don't want to do it like that. And we've seen, as a result of being in this cartel, most of our industry in Britain over the last 40 years been completely stripped out. We're no longer a manufacturing country. And I mean, for example, aircraft industry, car industry, steel industry has all become part of these largely German cartels now.
Well, Jonathan Fryer, Michel Barnier has said that the UK needs to clarify its position. We know that. It actually gave a 2-week deadline for the next stage of these Brexit talks. And the question that comes up is that if this doesn't happen from the UK, then it's going to jeopardize the trade talks that are going to kick off in December. Do you think that those trade talks are in jeopardy right now?
Yes, indeed, I think they are. These talks are within the framework of what's called the European Council, which is when the leaders of the EU member states get together and obviously will try to move things forward. But if there isn't a clear indication from Britain exactly what sort of relationship they are looking for, and if they haven't dealt with the outstanding issues, then I think it will be impossible for there to be an agreement in December, and that means that the whole thing will be pushed well into the new year. I would like to pick up one point, though, that Tony mentioned. Obviously, I don't agree with his point of view on this. The reason that Britain contributes so much to the EU is because a central part of the EU structures and philosophy is that richer countries should transfer resources to poorer countries. And that means, so for example, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and previously Poland received large amounts of money.
I'm sorry, I got to jump in and give Tony Gosling 30 seconds here. Tony Gosling, in closing, you have the floor.
Well, look, it's not just about money, and I'm afraid that's the way that the business people and generally the Blairites and the left of the Labour Party look at this. It's also about quality of life and the amount of money people have got to spend in their pockets at the end of every week. And we're now in a situation in Britain which we've been run by many of the Brussels people for such a long time now, and we just simply need to separate in order to reset our economy so that British people can decide on where people get jobs, because we desperately need decent paid jobs here, and that's not been the case for the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you for that. Investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Wiltshire, UK, and writer and lecturer Jonathan Fryer from London. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitawe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, goodbye.